September 14th, 1943. Outside Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine. The morning fog hung heavy over the steppes as Lieutenant Viktor Baranov peered through the vision port of his T-34 tank. His knuckles whitened against the cold steel of the controls, the tank's engine rumbling beneath him like an anxious beast. Across the field, somewhere in that mist, waited German panzer divisions, the dreaded Tigers and Panthers, their 88mm cannons capable of punching through Soviet armor at over 1,000 meters. Baranov felt confident nonetheless. The new tactics from high command would prove decisive in the coming engagement. The Germans would never expect what was coming. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Baranov and thousands of other Soviet tank commanders would discover in the following months would fundamentally transform armored warfare doctrine. This is not simply a tale of mechanical innovation, but of how a counterintuitive approach to tank movement would save countless lives and ultimately contribute to the Allied victory, all by literally turning conventional wisdom backward. The summer offensive of 1943 had been brutal for the Red Army's armored divisions. Following the massive tank battle at Kursk, Soviet losses mounted at an alarming rate, despite their numerical superiority. Colonel Sergei Morozov of the 5th Guards Tank Army studied the after-action reports with growing concern in his headquarters near Kharkov. "Comrade Colonel, these numbers cannot be correct," said Captain Dmitry Petrov, his aide, sliding yet another casualty report across the wooden desk. Morozov's eyes narrowed as he scanned the document. "Unfortunately, they are entirely accurate, Captain. We lost 28 T-34s in the Belgorod sector yesterday alone." "But how, sir? We outnumber the fascists 3-1 in that area." Morozov stood and walked to the large map pinned to the wall, tracing his finger along the front lines. "The problem is not our numbers, but our vulnerability. The Fritzes have figured out our weakness." He tapped the map with his knuckle. "Our frontal armor is holding up reasonably well against their 75mm guns, but our side and rear armor is too thin," Petrov finished. "Precisely. And now they're targeting us there. The Germans have adapted their tactics. They let our tanks advance, then hit us from the flanks and rear. The kill ratio is becoming unacceptable." Across the lines, Hauptmann Klaus Weber of the 21st Panzer Division was instructing his crews in exactly this tactic. In a clearing within a small forest west of Zaporizhzhia, 5 Panzer IV tanks were arranged in a semicircle as Weber used a stick to draw in the dirt. "Gentlemen, the Russians continue to attack in waves, relying on their numerical advantage," Weber explained to his tank commanders. "But their T-34 has a fatal flaw we can exploit. While the frontal armor is sloped and relatively effective, the side armor is only 45mm thick, and the rear is even thinner at 40mm. Oberleutnant Hans Müller raised his hand. "But sir, engaging their flanks puts us at risk of exposing our own vulnerabilities." Weber nodded. "A valid concern, Müller. That's why we're implementing the new Keil und Kessel tactic, wedge and cauldron. 2 tanks will engage frontally, forcing the Russian formation to focus forward, while the remaining 3 swing to the flank or rear." He drew the maneuver in the dirt with his stick. "Their commanders are trained to charge forward aggressively. We'll use that predictability against them." The German crews had reason for confidence. Their gunners were better trained, their commanders more experienced, and their tactics more sophisticated. The Russians still relied heavily on the simplistic, quantity has a quality all its own approach favored by Stalin. That same evening, in a farmhouse requisitioned as a temporary headquarters, Major Ivan Konev of the Soviet 9th Mechanized Corps sat studying the burnt-out hulk of a T-34 that had been towed back from the front. Engineers and mechanics swarmed around it, taking measurements and examining the damage patterns. "Show me again where the shells penetrated," Konev demanded of the chief engineer. The engineer, a civilian specialist named Mikhail Koshkin, who had worked at the Kharkov tank factory before the war, pointed to the scorched holes along the tank's side and rear. "As you can see, Major, all fatal hits were to the sides or rear. The frontal armor deflected 3 hits. You can see the impact marks here and here, but did not penetrate." Konev walked slowly around the destroyed tank, his mind racing. He had lost 8 tanks in his battalion the previous day, and 7 of them had been hit from the side or rear. "What if," he said slowly, almost thinking aloud, "we stopped presenting those vulnerabilities to the enemy?" Koshkin looked confused. "I don't follow, Comrade Major. Our front armor is strongest, yes? It can withstand hits that would penetrate the sides or rear. Certainly. The frontal armor is 60 millimeters thick and sloped at a 45-degree angle, effectively increasing its protection to nearly 90 millimeters equivalent. Then why do we always advance with our strongest armor toward the enemy? What if we reverse that approach?" The engineer's eyes widened as he grasped Konev's meaning. "You want to drive backward into battle?" "Not exactly backward," Konev clarified, "but with the front facing the most likely threat direction, even during withdrawal or repositioning." Koshkin frowned. "But the tanks weren't designed to operate that way. The driver's vision is limited when moving in reverse, and the speed is reduced." "Those are technical problems that can be overcome," Konev said dismissively. "The tactical advantage could be decisive." 2 days later, Konev presented his concept to Colonel Morozov and several other senior officers at Corps headquarters. The response was predictably skeptical. "This is absurd," scoffed General Rybalko, commanding the 3rd Tank Army. "Tanks are offensive weapons. They charge forward. That's how they've always been used." "With respect, Comrade General," Konev replied, "that predictability is killing our tankers. The Germans know we will charge. They count on it." Morozov, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "Major Konev's idea has merit. Unorthodox, yes, but we must adapt or continue to suffer unnecessary losses." "It will undermine morale," Rybalko insisted. "Our men will think they're retreating." "They'll think nothing of the sort if they survive engagements at a higher rate," Konev countered. "I propose a limited test with my battalion." Morozov nodded slowly. "Very well. You have 1 week to train your crews and demonstrate results." Across the front, similar discussions were taking place among Allied forces, though from different perspectives. In the British 8th Army, currently advancing through Italy, Major William Richardson of the Royal Tank Regiment was analysing combat data from North Africa and Sicily. "The statistics are quite clear," he told his commanding officer, Colonel Hargreaves. 70% of our tank losses come from flank or rear penetrations. The Germans have become experts at getting around our flanks." Hargreaves nodded gravely. "Sherman armor is thinner than we'd like, especially on the sides. But I don't see a tactical solution beyond improved coordination with our infantry and anti-tank units." Richardson spread several photographs on the table. "I've been corresponding with an American armor officer who observed Soviet tactics near Kursk. The Russians have begun experimenting with what they call reverse movement engagement, essentially keeping their stronger frontal armor oriented toward the enemy even when repositioning or withdrawing." "Driving backward into battle." Hargreaves looked skeptical. "Sounds rather desperate." "Not backward into battle, sir, but maintaining frontal protection during movement. The Russians claim it's reduced their losses by nearly 30% in limited trials." Hargreaves studied the photographs, which showed T-34 tanks with their main guns pointed toward the rear of their direction of travel. "It does make a certain sense, though it would require significant training to overcome the natural tendency to drive forward." Meanwhile, back in Ukraine, Konev was doing exactly that, training his crews in the new technique. In an abandoned collective farm 10 kilometers behind the front lines, 20 T-34 tanks maneuvered awkwardly across the fields. "No, no, no!" Konev shouted through a megaphone as a tank narrowly avoided colliding with a barn. "Kuznetsov, you must maintain awareness in all directions. The fact that you're driving in reverse doesn't mean you can ignore obstacles." Inside the lead tank, Sergeant Kuznetsov cursed under his breath. "This is impossible," he muttered to his driver, Private Sokolov. "How are we supposed to fight like this?" Sokolov, hunched over the controls, didn't take his eyes from his limited vision port. "Actually, once you get used to it, it's not so bad. And I'd rather take a hit on our frontal armor than our sides any day." Tank Commander Lieutenant Baranov climbed down from his turret and approached Konev. "The men are adapting, Comrade Major, but there are practical problems. Communication between driver and commander. is more critical now and more complex, and our speed is reduced by nearly half when moving this way. Konev nodded. I anticipated these issues. That's why I've had these made. He handed Baranov what looked like a modified tanker's helmet with an additional cable running from it. New intercom systems. They'll allow more efficient communication between crew members. And the speed issue? We'll compensate with improved tactics. The reduced speed is an acceptable trade-off for increased survival. Over the next 5 days, Konev drilled his tankers relentlessly in the new technique. They practiced rapid transitions between forward and reverse movement, maintaining formation while moving backward, and coordinating with infantry who were understandably confused by tanks that seemed to be retreating, yet were actually advancing their firepower. On September 24th, they would have their first opportunity to test the new tactic in actual combat. Intelligence reported a German armored thrust toward Soviet positions west of Zaporizhzhia, exactly where Konev's battalion was now deployed. Dawn broke clear and cold that day. Hauptmann Weber led his company of 15 Panzerführers across rolling farmland, advancing cautiously toward where reconnaissance reported Russian armor concentrating. All commanders, maintain standard wedge formation, Weber ordered through his radio. Remember, we expect the Russians to counterattack directly. When they do, Groups 2 and 3 will break off and move to flanking positions. The German tanks advanced steadily through morning mist that clung to the ground. Visibility was limited to about 400 meters, well within the effective range of their 75mm guns, but not ideal for coordinated maneuvers. Lieutenant Baranov watched the German advance through his binoculars from a concealed position behind a low ridge. His battalion of 20 T-34s was arrayed in an unusual formation, not the standard echelon or wedge that Soviet doctrine prescribed, but a loose, seemingly disorganized scatter. All stations, maintain position, he ordered through his new intercom system. Let them commit to their attack vector. The Germans continued their advance, unaware they had already been spotted. When they were approximately 800 meters from the Russian positions, Baranov gave his first order. All stations, start engines. The sound of 20 tank engines roaring to life carried across the fields, alerting the Germans that they had found their quarry. Contact imminent, Weber called to his commanders. Prepare to engage. What happened next confused the German tankers. Instead of the expected Russian charge, the Soviet tanks began moving backward from their concealed positions, their turrets and main guns still oriented toward the advancing Germans. What are they doing? Muller asked over the radio. Are they withdrawing already? Maintain formation, Weber ordered, though he too was puzzled. Advance and engage. The Soviet tanks continued their reverse movement, maintaining a disciplined formation despite moving backward. When the range closed to 600 meters, Baranov gave his next order. All stations, halt and engage. 20 85mm guns fired almost simultaneously. The effect was devastating. 4 Panzer IVs were hit in that first volley. 3 of them penetrated through their frontal armor. Scheiße, Weber cursed as he watched a tank to his right erupt in flames. Break formation. Implement Keil und Kessel now. The remaining German tanks attempted their practiced maneuver, with several breaking off to move toward the flanks of the Russian position. But as they did, the T-34s began moving again, still in reverse, still keeping their frontal armor and main guns facing the primary threat. They're countering our flanking movement, Muller reported, a note of alarm in his voice, maintaining frontal aspect to our advance. In his command tank, Baranov allowed himself a grim smile. All stations continue reverse movement by platoons, 2nd and 3rd platoons, angle 30 degrees outward to counter their flanking elements. The battle continued for 20 minutes. When it was over, the Germans had lost 9 tanks, while the Soviets had lost only 3, an exchange ratio previously unheard of on the Eastern Front, where German technical and tactical superiority typically resulted in lopsided victories despite being outnumbered. Word of this engagement spread quickly through the Soviet High Command. General Rybalko, who had been so dismissive of Konev's idea, requested a detailed report. Within 2 weeks, the reverse movement engagement technique was being taught to tank crews across the entire front. The impact was significant. By November 1943, Soviet tank loss rates had decreased by 40%, while mission effectiveness had actually increased. Crews were more willing to engage when they knew they had a better chance of survival, and the psychological effect of watching your friends burn in their tanks, a regular occurrence in earlier months, diminished considerably. In London, the War Office was receiving reports of the Soviet innovation with great interest. Brigadier Percy Hobart, an unconventional armour officer who had created the specialised Funnies tanks for the British, immediately grasped the potential. "This is brilliant in its simplicity," he told a gathering of senior Royal Armoured Corps officers. "The Soviets have essentially negated one of their main vulnerabilities without requiring any mechanical modifications to their vehicles." Major Richardson, who had been monitoring Soviet developments, added, "Our Sherman tanks have even greater need of this approach. Their frontal armour is 76 millimeters, but the sides are only 38, nearly identical to the T-34's vulnerability profile." Brigadier Hobart nodded. "I want training protocols developed immediately. We'll implement this with units preparing for the invasion of Europe." In Washington, the U.S. Army was similarly impressed. General Leslie McNair, responsible for training and doctrine development, ordered the armored force to investigate the technique. By December 1943, American tankers training at Fort Knox were practicing what they called hull forward withdrawal and frontal aspect maintenance, awkward terms for essentially the same tactic the Soviets had pioneered. Back on the Eastern Front, the Germans had taken notice of the change in Soviet tactics. An intelligence report from Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, dated October 10, 1943, noted, "Russian armoured units have adopted an unusual movement technique, maintaining frontal armour orientation during repositioning and tactical withdrawals. This has significantly reduced the effectiveness of our flanking tactics and increased our own losses in tank vs tank engagements." Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, was particularly concerned. In a message to OKH, Army High Command, he wrote, "The Russians have overcome a major tactical disadvantage through adaptation rather than technology. We must respond in kind or risk losing our remaining edge in armoured warfare." The Germans began developing counter-tactics, including the use of multiple smaller tank groups to force the Soviets to divide their attention, and increased deployment of infantry anti-tank teams to exploit the reduced speed and maneuverability of tanks moving in reverse. By early 1944, the new Soviet technique had evolved further. Lieutenant Baranov, now promoted to captain and commanding a full tank company, had refined the approach based on combat experience. "The key innovation," he explained to newly arrived replacement crews, "is not simply driving in reverse, but maintaining tactical flexibility while always presenting your strongest armour toward the greatest threat." He demonstrated using model tanks on a sand table. "We call this frontal aspect maintenance. When engaging multiple threats from different directions, we use what we call carousel movement, tanks moving in a circular pattern, each covering the others while always keeping their frontal armour toward the known enemy positions." One young lieutenant raised his hand. "But Captain, doesn't this reduce our offensive capability? Tanks are meant to charge and break through enemy lines." Baranov nodded. "A fair question. The answer is that survival is a prerequisite for offensive success. A destroyed tank breaks through nothing. We still conduct breakthrough operations, but we do so with greater tactical sophistication." He rearranged the model tanks. "For assaults, we now use a phalanx approach, forward movement with mutually supporting positions, allowing tanks to advance while covering each other's vulnerable areas." The refinements continued across all Allied forces as the war progressed. In preparation for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, British and American tankers received extensive training in these techniques. When Allied tanks rolled into Normandy in June 1944, many crews were well versed in what American General George S. Patton called directional armour employment, yet another term for the same basic concept. The impact on survival rates was dramatic. In the first month of the Normandy campaign, British units using the new technique consistently reported 30 to 40% lower loss rates than those that didn't. By August, virtually all Allied tankers were employing some version of the approach, but perhaps the most profound impact came in the psychological realm. Tank warfare had always been particularly terrifying, with crews knowing their vehicle could become their tomb in an instant. The implementation of tactics that demonstrably improved survival had a significant effect on morale and combat effectiveness. Before we learned these new movement techniques, I never expected to survive more than 2 or 3 engagements, wrote Sergeant Thomas Miller of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division in a letter home. Now I actually believe I might see the end of this war. It makes all the difference in the world to how you fight. The Germans, meanwhile, were facing increasing pressure on all fronts. Their own tank production couldn't match the combined output of the Allies, and their fuel situation was becoming desperate. By late 1944, German panzer divisions were increasingly forced into defensive operations where their mobility advantage, one of the few remaining edges they had, was negated. Oberleutnant Müller, now commanding his own tank company after Hauptmann Weber was killed in fighting near Kiev, found himself on the receiving end of the very tactics he had once exploited. "The Russians have become sophisticated in their armored tactics," he wrote in his war diary in November 1944. "They no longer charge blindly into our guns, but maneuver to bring their strengths against our weaknesses. Their new movement techniques make flank shots much harder to achieve. We are losing the qualitative edge that once compensated for their numerical superiority." As the war in Europe entered its final months, the reverse movement technique had become standard doctrine across all Allied armored forces. Statistical analysis conducted by the British Operational Research Section in March 1945 confirmed what frontline commanders already knew. Tanks employing the technique had a 78% higher survival rate in combat than those using traditional movement tactics. Captain Baranov, who had survived the entire campaign from Ukraine through Poland and into Germany, stood beside his T-34 on the outskirts of Berlin in April 1945. His tank, nicknamed Backwards Victor by his crew, had survived 37 confirmed engagements, an almost unheard-of record on the Eastern Front. "We have come a long way," he told his crew as they performed maintenance on their battle-scarred vehicle, "and not just in kilometers." His gunner, Sergeant Kuznetsov, the same man who had initially complained about the awkwardness of the new tactics, laughed. "Indeed, Comrade Captain, who would have thought that going backward would take us so far forward?" The driver, Sokolov, now a senior sergeant, patted the tank's hull affectionately. "I have driven this same tank for almost 2 years. Before we learned the new way, no tank in our battalion lasted more than 3 months." The impact of the reverse movement innovation extended beyond the war. In post-war tank design, the lessons learned influenced the development of new armored vehicles across all major military powers. The Soviet T-54 and T-55 tanks, which would become the most produced tank series in history, featured significantly improved all-around armor protection while maintaining the strongest protection at the front. American and British designs similarly emphasized balanced protection while acknowledging the tactical reality that perfect protection from all angles was impossible. More importantly, the doctrine of armored warfare permanently changed. The naive concept of tanks as primarily offensive, charge-forward weapons gave way to a more sophisticated understanding of combined arms tactics, positional advantage, and protection schemes. In 1955, during a conference at the Soviet Military Academy, Marshal of Tank Forces Pavel Rotmistrov, who had commanded tank armies during the war, explicitly credited the reverse movement technique with saving thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of tankers. "Wars are won by adaptation and innovation as much as by courage," he told the assembled officers. The simple idea that a tank should always present its strongest protection toward the enemy, regardless of its direction of movement, seems obvious in hindsight. But it required a complete rethinking of how we employed armored forces. In the West, the lesson was similarly acknowledged. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery wrote in his memoirs, "The Russians taught us all a valuable lesson in armor tactics. By simply reversing the conventional approach to tank movement, they achieved remarkable improvements in combat effectiveness, with no technical changes to their vehicles." The legacy of this tactical innovation continues to influence modern armored warfare. Contemporary tanks like the American M1 Abrams, German Leopard 2, and Russian T-90 all feature significantly heavier frontal armor than side or rear protection, and tactical doctrine still emphasizes the importance of maintaining frontal aspect toward threats. What began as a desperate improvisation by Major Konev to reduce catastrophic Soviet tank losses became one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war, not because it was technologically revolutionary, but because it represented a fundamental shift in thinking. For Lieutenant Viktor Baranov, who survived the war and eventually retired as a colonel in the Soviet army, the lesson was both professional and deeply personal. At a veterans' reunion in Moscow in 1975, he raised a toast to his fellow tankers. "To those who learned that sometimes to move forward in war, you must be willing to drive backward," he said. "And to those who never had the chance to learn this lesson, our comrades who fell before we understood." The statistics tell the story most eloquently. Before the implementation of the reverse movement technique, Soviet tank crews had an average combat life expectancy of 1.7 engagements. Afterward, that number rose to 7.4, a more than fourfold increase. American and British forces saw similar improvements once they adopted the approach. In the cold calculus of war, this translated to tens of thousands of lives saved and thousands of tanks preserved to fight another day. And in the end, it contributed significantly to the Allied victory by preserving both experienced crews and vital war material that would otherwise have been lost. The counterintuitive notion that driving a tank backward could be the key to moving forward against the enemy stands as a testament to human ingenuity under pressure, and a reminder that sometimes the most effective innovations are not about building better machines, but about using existing machines in better ways. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.